Morning didn't announce itself in the 1950s. It didn't buzz or glow or vibrate on a bedside table. It simply appeared, softly, through thin curtains that had already learned the shape of the window. The light came in pale and patient, settling on the floor first, then climbing slowly up the wall as if it wasn't in a hurry to be noticed. The house was cool, not cold, just cool enough to make you pull the blanket a little closer before letting go of it. Somewhere nearby, a clock moved forward with a sound so gentle it blended into the room, not reminding anyone of time, just keeping it. You could smell the morning before you saw it, a trace of soap lingering from the night before, the faint warmth of something beginning in the kitchen, coffee maybe, or toast. The smell didn't rush ahead of itself. It waited. There was no immediate talking. Footsteps came later, careful and familiar, as if the floorboards were old friends. A chair slid back slightly. A cabinet opened and closed. The radio hummed before it spoke, testing its own voice, then settling into a calm tone that felt more like company than information. Outside, the world was already awake, but not demanding attention. A car passed once, then nothing. A bird landed somewhere unseen. The street held its breath between moments. No one checked the time yet. They didn't need to. The morning followed a rhythm everyone already knew. There was a sense that the day had been here before and would return again tomorrow, so there was no pressure to grab it too tightly. At the time, it felt ordinary, so ordinary it barely registered. Just another morning beginning the same way it always did. Only much later would it feel different. Only later would it become clear that this quiet beginning was doing more than starting the day. It was teaching something about steadiness, about patience, about how life could move forward without being pushed. And now, remembering it, the feeling raises a quiet question. Was that calm simply comfort? Or was it something we didn't realize we were being taught? After the morning fully arrived, the house began to breathe. Not all at once, not loudly. It happened in pieces. A sound here, a pause there. The kind of rhythm you didn't notice unless it stopped. The radio was usually the first steady voice, not turned up high, just loud enough to fill the empty space between rooms. News read calmly, music that didn't rush itself. The radio didn't ask anyone to listen closely. It was simply there, like another person in the house who didn't need conversation. Footsteps followed familiar paths. Someone crossed the hallway the same way they always did, careful not to wake anyone who didn't need to be awake yet. The floorboards answered softly, each one known by memory, stepped around or leaned into depending on where they creaked. In the kitchen, small sounds stacked on top of each other. A kettle warming, a spoon touching a cup once, maybe twice. The quiet scrape of a pan moved into place. Cabinets opened and closed with intention, never slammed. Everything had its order, and the house responded by staying calm. Then there were the pauses, moments where nothing happened at all. No voices, no movement, just still air and the radio carrying on as if it understood that silence was part of the arrangement. Those pauses weren't uncomfortable. They were expected, almost necessary. Children learned from this without anyone explaining it. They learned that not every moment needed filling. That sound didn't mean urgency. That silence didn't mean something was wrong. The house itself seemed to teach that lesson. Today, houses are filled with noise that demands reaction. Back then, Sound existed without instructions. It didn't pull you forward. It didn't follow you from room to room. It stayed where it was, letting you move around it instead. Looking back now, that mattered more than it seemed. Those quiet sounds created a sense of steadiness, a feeling that life was happening at a manageable pace, that nothing was chasing you yet. At the time, it felt normal, just the sound of a house doing what houses did. Only later did it become clear how rare it would feel to be surrounded by activity that didn't ask anything from you at all. Getting dressed in the 1950s was not a decision-making process. It was a continuation of the morning. Clothes waited where they had been left the night before, folded carefully, hung in the same place every day. There was no standing in front of a closet wondering who to be. The choice had already been made by routine, by expectation, by the quiet agreement between a person and the day ahead. Fabric mattered. You felt it immediately. The coolness of a freshly pressed shirt, the weight of denim that hadn't yet softened for the morning, the familiar resistance of buttons that had been fastened thousands of times before. Even shoes carried memory, creased in the same places, shaped by the same steps. Adults moved through this ritual with calm efficiency, not rushed, but certain. Sleeves rolled or left down depending on the work ahead. Hair was combed the same way it had been yesterday and the day before that. There was comfort in not needing to reinvent yourself before breakfast. Children watched closely. They noticed how clothes were treated, how a jacket wasn't tossed aside but hung carefully, how a small tear wasn't ignored but fixed later. Clothing wasn't disposable. It carried responsibility. What you wore wasn't meant to express your inner world. It was meant to prepare you for the outer one. That idea settled quietly. You dressed to meet the day, not to stand out from it, to belong within it. Looking back now, there's something steady in that memory, a sense that identity wasn't something you had to broadcast. It was something you carried quietly, reinforced by repetition. At the time, it felt ordinary, just clothes, just another step in the morning. Only later did it begin to feel like a lesson about consistency, about self-respect, about how much energy is saved when you're not constantly asking who you're supposed to be. And maybe that's one of the things we forgot. Meals in the 1950s were not performances. They didn't arrive with anticipation or commentary. They simply appeared, dependable as the time of day itself. The table waited where it always had. Its surface carried small marks from years of use, tiny scratches, worn edges, places where hands had rested again and again. Chairs were pulled out the same distance every time. Plates were set without ceremony. There was no need to make it special. It already was. Food came in familiar forms, nothing surprising, nothing meant to impress. The smell reached you first, steady and reassuring. You knew what it was before you saw it, and that knowing brought comfort. The meal didn't ask for attention, it offered grounding. People sat down because it was time to sit down, not because they were starving, not because they were bored, because this was the moment where the day paused, however briefly. Conversation happened naturally, or didn't. Some days were quiet. Some days carried small stories from work or school. No one forced it. Silence at the table wasn't awkward. It was accepted. The important thing was presence. Children learned this rhythm without instruction. They learned that eating was something done together, even when no one felt like talking. That the table was a place you returned to, not a place you rushed away from. Later, long after the dishes were cleared, that feeling stayed. The sense that no matter what happened outside the house, there was always a point in the day where everything slowed down enough to be held. At the time, it felt routine, just another meal, just something that happened every day. Only years later did it become clear how anchoring that routine had been, how it quietly taught that life didn't need constant stimulation to feel full. That nourishment wasn't only about food. The table didn't solve problems. It didn't make life easier, but it made life steadier. And sometimes that was enough. In the 1950s, time had no urgency to explain itself. There were long stretches where nothing in particular was happening, and no one felt the need to fix that. You waited because waiting was part of the day. Water took time to boil. The mail arrived when it arrived. Evening came when the light decided it was ready to leave. No one reached for distraction right away. There was nothing to reach for. Children sat on steps or leaned against door frames, watching shadows move across the ground. They followed dust in a beam of sunlight without realizing how long they had been standing there. Adults waited too, quietly, hands in pockets, eyes resting somewhere distant, thoughts moving at their own pace. Boredom existed, but it wasn't treated as a problem. It was just another feeling, like hunger or tiredness, that passed on its own. And in that passing, something else took its place: imagination, observation, a deeper awareness of the world moving slowly around you. Waiting taught patience without instruction. It taught that not every moment needed a purpose to be valuable. That stillness wasn't wasted time. Looking back now, it's easy to forget how much space there was between moments, how the day unfolded in long, gentle arcs instead of sharp segments, how time felt wide enough to sit inside. Adults didn't speak about this. They didn't frame it as a lesson. They simply lived within it, and children followed. At the time, it felt normal. Time just moved that way. Only later did it become noticeable, especially when that space began to disappear, when waiting started to feel uncomfortable, when silence felt like something that needed to be filled. That's when the memory changes shape. What once felt unremarkable begins to feel generous. And maybe that's what time was offering back then. Not efficiency, not productivity, just enough room to breathe. Money in the 1950s wasn't invisible. It didn't move quietly through numbers on a screen or disappear with a tap. It had shape, weight, sound. You could hear it being counted. You could feel it leaving. Bills were folded carefully, often kept in the same place every day. Envelopes mattered. So did handwriting. Amounts were written down, not because people loved records, but because remembering mattered. What came in and what went out stayed close to the surface of the mind. Most households lived within narrow margins, often one income, sometimes seasonal work, sometimes hours that stretched longer than planned. A gallon of milk cost less than $1, a loaf of bread only a few cents. But even then, purchases were considered. Nothing felt automatic. If something broke, it wasn't replaced immediately. It was examined first. Could it be fixed? Could it wait? A small tear in clothing meant a needle later, not a trip to the store. Appliances were discussed before they were bought, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. Children noticed this. They saw adults hesitate at counters. They watched money change hands slowly. They learned that wanting something didn't mean having it. And strangely, that lesson didn't feel cruel. It felt grounding. Spending carried consequence, but also intention. When something was finally bought, it meant something, not because it was expensive, but because it had been chosen carefully. There were no speeches about financial responsibility, no warnings delivered with urgency. The lesson lived in the routine, in the pause before buying, in the quiet relief of staying within limits. At the time, it felt normal, just the way things were handled. Only later did it become clear how much that awareness shaped behavior, how it encouraged restraint without shame, how it taught that enough could actually be enough. Money didn't promise happiness. It didn't pretend to solve everything, but it stayed honest. And that honesty, remembered now, feels almost unfamiliar. In the 1950s, the world didn't stop at the edge of the house. It extended quietly into the street, the sidewalk, the nearby porches that faced each other without fences between them. Neighbors were simply there, not always close friends, not always people you shared your thoughts with, but familiar enough that their presence blended into the day. You recognized footsteps before faces. You knew who left early in the morning and who returned late. You noticed when curtains stayed closed longer than usual. There were small acknowledgments that required no effort. A nod while passing, a hand raised briefly from across the street, a few words exchanged near a mailbox. No one tried to turn these moments into anything more than they were. Children moved between houses without announcing themselves. They knew which doors were open to them and which weren't. Adults kept a quiet watch without hovering. The street itself felt like a shared space, not something to retreat from. Help appeared naturally. A package watched over. A borrowed tool returned later, clean. Someone keeping an eye on things when another was away. None of it required gratitude speeches. It was simply how people lived alongside each other. This wasn't closeness built on confession. It was familiarity built on repetition. At the time, it didn't feel remarkable. No one described it as community. It was just life happening within view of others. Only later did that feeling begin to fade. When doors closed more tightly, when interactions required planning, when knowing someone's name became optional. Looking back, the comfort wasn't in deep connection. It was in quiet awareness, in knowing that if something went wrong, someone would notice, not because they were watching closely, but because they were there. Children in the 1950s were not constantly instructed. They were observed less, and in return, they observed more. They watched adults move through the day without explanation, how work clothes were put on with a certain seriousness, how voices changed slightly when a neighbor appeared, how hands slowed down when something delicate needed attention. No one paused to describe what any of it meant. The meaning came later. Rules were present, but they weren't always spoken. Children learn when it was time to be quiet by feeling the room change. They learned when to step back by noticing a look or a pause. They learned responsibility by being trusted with small things, carrying something fragile, remembering a message, locking a door. There was space to make mistakes, too. Not loudly corrected, not recorded, just noticed, adjusted, and folded into the next attempt. Adults didn't try to shape every moment. They didn't hover. They expected children to learn by proximity, by being near grown-up life long enough for it to sink in. That expectation carried weight. It made children feel capable before they fully understood why. Looking back now, there's something quietly powerful about that. Learning didn't feel like pressure. It felt like becoming. At the time, It felt natural, just the way things happened. Only later did it become clear how much that kind of learning required patience from adults, and how much trust. Trust that children would absorb what mattered if they were simply allowed to watch long enough. Not every lesson landed perfectly. Not every child experienced it the same way. But the rhythm was there. And in that rhythm, children learn not just how to behave, but how to belong. Evenings in the 1950s didn't fall all at once. They arrived slowly, almost carefully, as if the day itself knew it was time to let go. The light was the first thing to change. It softened rather than disappeared, turning pale and angled, stretching shadows across walls and sidewalks. Indoors, the brightness narrowed. Lamps were switched on one by one, never all at once, each one creating a small island of warmth in an otherwise dim room. The house didn't become darker, it became quieter. Work clothes were folded or hung away, not tossed aside. Shoes rested near the door, carrying the dust of the day with them. The sharp edges of responsibility dulled. Whatever hadn't been finished would wait. Evening didn't ask for completion, it allowed pause. The radio sounded different then. Voices slowed. Music felt steadier, less insistent. Sometimes the radio was turned off entirely, leaving only the soft sounds of the house, the faint clink of a plate being set down, water running briefly, floorboards settling as if tired themselves. Children felt this shift instinctively. Play wound down without argument. Energy folded inward. There was no announcement that bedtime was approaching, no countdown. The body understood before the clock did. Outside, the neighborhood followed the same rhythm. Fewer cars passed. Voices drifted indoors. Porch lights came on. Small signals that the day was ending everywhere at once. The street felt held, watched over by dim light and familiarity. There was comfort in knowing the world would quiet itself, that you didn't have to force rest. It came naturally, carried in by the dark. At the time, it felt unremarkable. Just evening doing what it always did. Only later did that memory take on weight, especially when nights stopped feeling like closures and started feeling like extensions of the day, when light stayed harsh, when noise never softened, when rest became something you had to fight for. Looking back, those evenings feel generous, not because they were perfect, but because they allowed an ending. The day didn't collapse. It closed, gently, predictably, and without asking for anything more. The lessons of the 1950s were rarely spoken out loud. They didn't arrive as advice or warnings or carefully framed wisdom. They settled in quietly, through repetition, through rhythm, through the way days were allowed to unfold without constant interference. Life moved with an understanding that not everything needed attention at once. Mornings began without urgency. Work filled its place. Evenings closed things gently. In between, there was structure, steady enough to lean on, loose enough to breathe inside. People learned to wait without resentment, to repair before replacing, to show up without announcing themselves. These weren't rules written down anywhere. They were absorbed by living alongside them long enough. Children carried these lessons forward without realizing it. They learned that identity could be stable. That belonging didn't require explanation. That effort mattered more than performance. Even when they later moved away from that world, something of it stayed in the background, a sense of pacing, of restraint, of enough. Of course, not everything was ideal. Not every home felt safe. Not every routine felt comforting. Memory smooths edges. Time edits what we keep. Different families experience different versions of the same decade. But the feeling underneath, the one that lingers, was real. It was the feeling that life didn't need to be constantly adjusted to be livable. That meaning could come from repetition. That calm could exist without being earned. Somewhere along the way, many of those quiet lessons were set aside, replaced with speed, with choice, with constant explanation. And in gaining all that movement, something steadier slipped out of reach. Maybe that's why the memory still returns, not as nostalgia for objects or fashion or music, but for a way of moving through time that didn't exhaust itself. The 1950s didn't teach this loudly. It taught it by example. And perhaps that's what we've been remembering all along. Not the decade itself, but the feeling of a life that knew when to move and when to rest.